Reflections. The Descent. Excerpts from Disappointment with God, 3 Questions No One Asks Aloud, by Philip Yancey. Suppose there was a king who loved a humble maiden. Begins a story by Kierkegaard. The king was like no other king. Every statesman trembled before his power. No one dared breathe a word against him, for he had the strength to crush all opponents. And yet this mighty king was melted by love for a humble maiden. How could he declare his love for her? In an odd sort of way, his very kingliness tied his hands. If he brought her to the palace and crowned her head with jewels and clothed her body in royal robes, she would surely not resist. No one dared resist him. But would she love him? She would say she loved him, of course, but would she truly? Or would she live with him in fear, nursing a private grief for the life she had left behind? Would she be happy at his side? How could he know? If he rode to her forest cottage in his royal carriage, with an armed escort waving bright banners, that too would overwhelm her. He did not want a cringing subject. He wanted a lover, an equal. He wanted her to forget that he was a king and she a humble maiden, and to let shared love cross over the gulf between them. For it is only in love that the unequal can be made equal, concluded Kierkegaard. The king, convinced he could not elevate the maiden without crushing her freedom, resolved to descend. He clothed himself as a beggar and approached her cottage incognito, with a worn cloak fluttering loosely about him. It was no mere disguise, but a new identity he took on. He renounced the throne to win her hand. What Kierkegaard expressed in parable form, the Apostle Paul expressed in these words about Jesus Christ, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Philippians 2, verses 6 through 8. In his dealings with human beings, God had often humbled himself. I see the Old Testament as one long record of his condescensions, to descend to be with. God condescended in various ways to speak to Abraham and to Moses and to the nation of Israel and the prophets. But no condescension could match what came next, after the 400 years of silence. God, like the king in Kierkegaard's parable, took on a new form. He became a man. It was the most shocking descent imaginable. Fear not. We hear the words every Christmas season at church pageants, when children dress up in bathrobes and act out the story of Jesus' birth. Fear not, lisps the 6-year-old angel, his bedsheet costume dragging the ground, his coat hanger framed wings flapping ever so slightly from the trembling of his body. He sneaks a glance at the script hidden in the folds of his sleeve. Fear not, for I bring you good tidings of great joy. Already he has appeared to Zachariah, his older brother, and to Mary, a freckled blonde from the 2nd grade. He used the same greeting for both. Fear not. These were also God's first words to Abraham, and to Hagar, and to Isaac. Fear not, the angel said in greeting Gideon and the prophet Daniel. For supernatural beings, that phrase served almost as the equivalent of, "Hello, how are you?" Little wonder. By the time these supernatural beings spoke, the human being was usually lying face down in a cataleptic state. When God made contact with planet Earth, sometimes the supernatural encounter sounded like thunder. Sometimes it stirred the air like a whirlwind, and sometimes it lit up the scene like a flash of phosphorus. Nearly always it caused fear. But the angel who visited Zechariah and Mary and Joseph heralded that God was about to appear in a form that would not frighten. What could be less scary than a newborn baby with jerky limbs and eyes that do not quite focus? In Jesus, born in a barn or cave and laid in a feeding trough, God found at last a mode of approach that humanity need not fear. The king had cast off his robes. I think of the condescension involved, the incarnation, which sliced history into two parts, a fact even our calendars grudgingly acknowledge, had more animal than human witnesses. Think, too, of the risk. In the incarnation, God spanned the vast chasm of fear that had distanced him from his human creation. But removing that barrier made Jesus vulnerable, terribly vulnerable. The child born in the night among beasts, the sweet breath and steaming dung of beasts, and nothing is ever the same again. Those who believe in God can never in a way be sure of him again. Once they have seen him in a stable, they can never be sure where he will appear, or to what lengths he will go, or to what ludicrous depths of self-humiliation he will descend in his wild pursuit of man. For those who believe in God, it means this birth, that God himself is never safe from us, and maybe that is the dark side of Christmas, the terror of the silence. He comes in such a way that we can always turn him down, as we could crack the baby's skull like an eggshell, or nail him up when he gets too big for that. How did Christmas Day feel to God? Imagine for a moment becoming a baby again, giving up language and muscle coordination, and the ability to eat solid food and control your bladder. God as a fetus. Or imagine yourself becoming a sea slug. That analogy is probably closer. On that day in Bethlehem, the maker of all that is took form as a helpless, dependent newborn. Kenosis is the technical word theologians use to describe Christ emptying himself of the advantages of deity. Ironically, while the emptying involved much humiliation, it also involved a kind of freedom. A physical body freed Christ to act on a human scale. He could say what he wanted without his voice blasting the treetops. He could express anger by calling King Herod a fox, or by reaching for a bullwhip in the temple, rather than shaking the earth with his stormy presence. And he could talk to anyone, a prostitute, a blind man, a widow, a leper, without first having to announce, "Fear not." 'Twas much that man was made like God before, but that God should be made like man, much more.